Hello, and welcome to the 101st episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. Today we are recording the podcast episode to go with Ancient Warfare issue 13.6, which is all about Claudius at war. We got a couple of questions in for the team to answer, and with me today are Murray Dahm, the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare, Mark McCaffrey, Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, and there's me, Jasper Orthuis, and I'm the editor of the magazine. Let's just start off with some questions and see where we can take it from here. The fun one. Let's start with the fun one. Cosmos from Patreon asks, Cassius Dio relates Claudius bringing war elephants. I can't find this practical. I don't think anybody did. Maybe that was not the point. Did he use them as a show-off, maybe? Are they mentioned in any of the battles? I think the Roman army elephants were kind of obsolete, and also landscape and especially the weather of Britain would have been a challenge for them. I think he hasn't read the issue yet because Murray wrote an article about this.
Next question.
Indeed. Exactly
right. Just leave something for people to be read. But can you answer the question?
Yes, it's one of those very brief answers that Dio Cassius is the only historian to record that Claudius prepared elephants to be taken to Britain. So the specific reference for you is Book 60, Chapter 21, 1-2, and that's basically it. So Dio Cassius says he took elephants, which has then caused all sorts of issues. The funny thing about it, of course, is that the practicalities of taking elephants to Britain in the 1st century AD. How did he do it? Did he build these? The transports for elephants must have been very tricky. Blah blah blah. The other idea, of course, is that you've got what would the effect of an elephant be in Britain? Polyaenus has a stratagem about Julius Caesar actually having an elephant in Britain, which there's no evidence for other than that stratagem, saying when this elephant appeared, the Britons ran from it, not knowing what this strange beast looked like. And so, that's an aphraxis because that's very similar to Herodotus's horses not being able to abide camels. In this case, Britain or Britunculi not being able to abide elephants. And so that the interesting thing there is, of course, that if there's an association of elephants in Britain through Julius Caesar, then Claudius, even being rumored to take an elephant to Britain, is about the association with Caesar in conquering Britain at all. So, and there's coins of Caesar's conquest of Britain which have an elephant crushing what we think is a snake or a dragon, which may be victory or luck. Which, again, the elephant is associated with the sun in ancient sort of philosophy and mythology. So there's all sorts of interesting tie-ins there. We know that Caesar had elephants in one of his triumphs. Unfortunately, one triumph is the African triumph, in which case having elephants makes a lot of sense. The other one was his Gallic triumph, and depending on the source, Dio Cassius or Suetonius, one or the other has elephants. So in another account, there are elephants in the Gallic triumph, which again reinforces the idea that maybe Caesar had elephants there, which makes no sense at all. I think the earliest, or the latest we know of elephants being used in Rome is for some games in the 40s. Both Pompey and Caesar have elephants in the arena in the 40s. So look, it's possible. And as I wrote in the magazine, when they found some mammoth remains, they immediately identified them as the elephants of Claudius in Britain, and it's appeared in several works of fiction that there's an elephant wandering around Britain getting buried in a bog, which of course makes the whole point of Polyaenus' stratagem that the Britons wouldn't know what elephants look like. Well, if they had mammoths once upon a time, probably they're not that foreign. Anyway, I jumped forward millennia in that comment. So I think the funny thing is possibly there's the idea that elephant quadriga were erected in Claudius's honor that maybe suggests that they were associated with it. I think the Dover Museum had a model of Claudius marching with elephants, in his 16-day trip up country in Britain. So it's possible, but I think it's probably highly unlikely. But the association with the elephant is the sort of key. So it was a propaganda device, shall we say?
Well, I'm going to throw in, I think that it's just the optics of elephants. I mean, these are blooming impressive animals. It's an indication that the Romans can actually bring these animals over huge distances. And the Britons presumably hadn't seen them before. So along comes this man with these creatures from another continent, literally. And in fact, if you read Pliny the Elder, he's got huge trunks of text about elephants. So I think that the Romans are just saying,
So did you just say huge trunks of text?
I said huge chunks.
Hilarious.
The trunks would be a very good pun, wouldn't it?
I heard trunks of text, and I thought you were making.
Well, I have to check the transcription of this particular podcast.
But I mean, it's just so Pliny the Elder has all sorts of things, like, for example, how to catch an elephant, how to move them around. So clearly they capture the imagination. I would imagine they're a bit like having an aircraft carrier or something today. The fact that you show it off.
And the Punic Wars, when having to build these earthen platforms so that they would travel, not knowing they weren't on land. If you're thinking about crossing the English Channel, building a mobile zoo, just the logistics. And I think there are obviously several.
It wouldn't be the first time that Romans did something weird.
Exactly right.
No matter the logistics.
It's also, you've got the description of the Veneti ships, the style of shipbuilding that they adopt for the Roman fleet going across for the second invasion of Caesar. And from that time on, they're talking about very stable ships. So perhaps. I mean, can I also mention in Suetonius, he mentions about elephants being used to draw chariots in triumphs, or not triumphs, in processions. I think it's about Messalina. I was just looking for it just then, but I think it's Messalina who's given permission by Claudius to be drawn in a cart drawn by elephants or something. I'm just trying to check who it was, but it's somewhere in the life of Claudius that he's giving, and again, that might just lead to a confusion in our sources for Dio Cassius, basically thinking that, picking it up from ceremony. I mean, also, where do these elephants come from? I mean, we know that there's a breeding facility in terms of war elephants to the south of Rome, I think near Laurentium. But in terms of getting them up to Britannia, where else are they going to be coming from?
London Zoo, of course.
There's evidence of them in Spain, I think. I think there's evidence in Spain. But again, marching them through Spain and then up through Gaul was amazing. You would imagine like the good old fashioned circus processions that you used to get when the circus came to town. I don't think it happens these days. You can just imagine elephants marching through Gaul and every village turning out to see these amazingly strange creatures. I always thought that when you saw the beast fights and they would depict giraffes as these ferocious beasts, and you're like, no, giraffes, they're not ferocious, are they? I don't recall giraffes being ferocious, as opposed to hippopotamuses being friendly.
Have a look at giraffes fighting.
You're like, no.
But what's amazing is that Pliny even mentions different So for example, Pliny even mentions different kinds of it. He actually knows about Indian elephants as well as African elements, and says actually the African element is afraid of the Indian and does not dare as much as look at it, for the latter is a much greater bulk. So I mean, I think once again that shows that the Romans are very connected into this whole ecosystem of wild animals, and the fact they can move them around is a very, very strong message of their control of the world.
But then when you talk about, we get that great description of Claudius actually going from Rome to Britannia, and you get his whole trip from Rome down to Ostia, on board ship from Ostia up the coast, encountering, we're told, 2 storms, which then lead him to disembarking at Marseille, going by land across France, across Gaul, to the Channel coastline, and getting... Where do the elephants fit in on that whole scale? I mean, are they coming by some other route? Are they already there at the Channel waiting for him, prearranged or something? Or if there are elephants, plural.
Well, I think the unuseful phrase in Dio Cassius is prepared. that they were, everything was prepared for the trip, including elephants, which doesn't really give you much detail at all. You're right. Look, I must stand corrected. There's 10 million views on giraffe versus giraffe, deadliest fight ever seen. So I'm clearly mistaken about the fighting ability.
You haven't been watching Adam Bird enough, have you?
Clearly not. Clearly not.
It pays to have a daughter who's into her nature programs, of course. So.
Well, mine are into Harry Potter and have just gotten to Star Wars. So, well, not to mention, of course, TikTok dancing. But that's I can't see it. I can't see TikTok for ancient historians unless it's us. So we'll see what happens.
But to that point, though, I think what it highlights is the fact that campaigns are planned. He's planned to win this campaign, so he's actually got all the logistics worked out beforehand, including elephants. That's how confident he is in his general.
That segues into one of the other questions, doesn't it?
Of course. I have my purposes.
Well, should we go there straight away then? At least, well, which one do you mean? It's confusing.
The last one. The last one.
All right. Well, because it sort of connects well with the first one as well, because it's also a lot. The optics of this whole campaign have been mentioned several times in the issue. But Gareth on Facebook asked, how did Emperor Claudius manage to invade and stay in Britain while Caesar didn't? And we assume that we'll read Claudius not as a person, but as a personification of the Roman Empire. Lindsay, I think, desperately wanted to pick that up. So,
well, there's a number of questions inside that one question. Is like how did he manage to invade, and how did he stay? I think the invasion, from what we gather, was a joint amphibious operation, because that's the only way to get across the Channel. So clearly, you need a fleet, and you need all the transport you can get, and that's, I think, all described in the literature. There's a kind of underpinning question, which I think is the why did he want to do it, as opposed to Caesar. And in the preamble to this, we were talking about this question. Caesar did it for the political optics, because Britain at this point is so far away in the imagination of the Roman audience, and it plays wonderfully to his politicking with voters, if you will, for his bigger agenda. That to be able to say he's actually been to the equivalent of the moon and come back not once but twice is very powerful. Claudius's motivation was very different. The way I look at it is this: that Claudius was the younger son of Nero Claudius Drusus. And unlike his esteemed brother Germanicus Caesar, who had a wonderful military record, he didn't have one. So if you think about it, that the whole family, the father, the brother, had actually, their fields of glory were actually across the Rhine in Germany, Germania, to varying degrees of success. And really the role model was the father. And I think the clue there is the fact, if you look at the coins, amongst the very first issue of coins that Claudius issues are actually De Germanis. They actually show the arch of Nero Claudius Drusus with the expression of Germans, with captives and various things on the top, including an equine statue of his father. And the appeal there is directly that I am descended from this great warrior hero that is called Nero Claudius Drusus, who ultimately is also declared imperator. So the British invasion offers him that political capital that he won't get any other way, because he's already, in his 50s by the time he's picked. So when Britain is actually in the early phases of conquest, one of the first things he does is he issues a new series of coins, mimicking very closely the first series, where they're De Britannis, of Britons. So in fact, what he's able then to do is gradually wean himself off having to associate with his father, because there's a series of coins. There's some Dipondi and Sesterci where they show Claudius on the one I think it's the reverse side, where he's sitting on a pile of arms and military equipment. So he's bolstering his military credentials. And on the other side, the reverse, I think, is a profile of his father. So again, he's trying to build this connection. I've got good genes in my family. But when he actually is able to establish a foothold with elephants in the army of Britannia, he is now himself the military man with credentials. So I think he actually played to win. Caesar played, first of all, I think it was an invasion, and then it was just basically a campaign. And there's a book reverted in the current issue. You can read about one interpretation of that whole thing. Claudius was intending to stay there and scaled it up accordingly. What was it, 3-4 legions and support troops and so on? The intention was to take it and hold it for good.
Yeah, but it's clearly about the whole this actually connects into another question that we have. How much do we know of his military exploits based on natural progress? Asks Brian on Patreon, instead of the invasion of Britain being over Claudius' need to overcome the public perception of his physical impediments. It's pretty clear from the sources that Claudius was not considered. That his family didn't see a great future in him, but Germanicus unfortunately managed to die well before the question came up of succession, and then Claudius was, because of the family connections, probably he was the only one remaining to still be connected to Augustus in some way, and he was connected to Nero Claudius Drusus. But he had these physical impediments. He had no reputation for any military achievement at all. So he had to do something. The point that is usually missed, but is made in the issue by Joe Ball, is that he does go into Germany first, and his armies go into Germany, and he manages to recapture the last missing eagle standard that was lost in the Varian disaster. So that is another connection to those the achievements of his father and his brother that show that he is capable of doing of these military feats. And then he goes into Britain, probably, and that's again, it's not a spontaneous plan to go into Britain, because Caligula, the preparations in Suetonius, especially for Caligula's campaign into Britain, are, I think we can safely say they're roundly marked. There's a story that he has his soldiers collecting seashells on the shore of the North Sea, and that he takes ships back all the way from the North Sea back to Rome, and they're making him ridiculous. But archaeological research has shown that logistics bases were built or expanded, especially in the Western Netherlands. So on the in the Rhine estuary, where you would, there's no point in doing that here unless you're planning to go west, which shows that Caligula had serious plans before he was cut short, and Claudius could build upon that and get this campaign going in really a fairly short time, and with or without elephants.
Well, actually, and to that point, there's a growing, I think, agreement amongst some scholars using archaeology, particularly of, if you think about Chichester, Fishbourne Roman Palace. I mean, there's a series of buildings in the development of what became the palace, and one of them seems to be some sort of military installation, maybe possibly an entrepot or something. But the possibility is that before AD 43. There certainly was trade with the Romans, but there could have been more than that. There could have actually been some kind of exploratory, military advisors, to use the sort of the American Army approach to these things.
Let's make Britain Vietnam. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the Romans had treaty allies in the Rhegini tribe, which is the one which the famous Togedubnus was ultimately made client king, and further up to Silchester, where you have again another ally, and there's a whole series of coins that come out around about the time between Julius Caesar and Claudius, where the coinage is written in Latin words. So, for example, Rex is a particular thing that comes through the coinage.
Going back to Togedubnus, he, of course, there's the suggestion that he's actually got a Roman education. So yes, the possibility that he's actually been taken from Britain to possibly Rome, and that is as a precursor to being a client king. Yeah. So if that's the case, then that's predating this way before the Claudian invasion. So,
we know that there are client kings going back and forth between Britain, and they go all the way back to Augustus. where it's actually in his Res Gestae, where he actually says, "I've received British kings amongst many other people." So in the Roman imagination, I think after Julius Caesar, there's this political connection with allies already in the British Isles. And as treaty allies, those people can actually call upon the Romans to intercede and act on their behalf. So you sometimes wonder whether maybe Togodumnus was part of this subterfuge, which is, well, we're only doing what our best friends are asking us to do, which is to be there and help the old guy out. And now we've got to stay, of course.
I think there's a point we're missing in all of this, which of course is, and it ties back to Caligula being mocked for bringing seashells back from the North Sea, but it also ties into the archaeology. And of course, when you go to any of the remains of the forts, there's evidence in the walls themselves, and that is, I think, the entire invasion of Britain is because the Romans loved British oysters, and you know, it's an invasion for a foodstuff, because we have so much archaeological evidence of oysters being consumed in vast amounts, not only in Britain itself, but in the remainder of the empire. That you know, that seems to be the best thing that Britain as province is offering.
I don't know how well they travel once they get past the channel and they go.
Well, you know, that's why you make them into a particularly stinky sauce, and then that goes anywhere. So, you know, don't know.
But it's an intriguing question. I think what this points to is that the preparation is everything, and there's layers of political preparation, laying the groundwork with having allies on the ground who can actually give you a foothold, and you can use that as a base, and you can then actually, like D-Day, you can actually bring in material in depth, and you can actually launch your invasion from that point in, and just the logistics and bringing the army together and doing it on with the intention of winning. And I think Claudius, because he was actually a book student, he actually read a lot, probably appreciated the finer details of military strategy.
I think it's also, I think the point was made in the magazine as well, that in making a client king, it usually involves some degree of ceremony, and the fact that Claudius is going in person indicates that, you know, that process has moved along to such an extent that they are ready for him to be there for the, you know, the officialdom. And as much as we might say, oh, that's going on from the invasion of the previous year or year and a half, probably not. It's probably actually built on a lot more. And it's a shame that we only get this, you know, the Suetonius and the Dio Cassius emphasis on Claudius going over there, and then of course as soon as he goes back to Rome, that's it. We lose focus on Britannia for the next 20 odd years, and of course we don't see the continuing build up of what has started with the client, you know, negotiations for client kingdoms being established, and see what actually happens next. Unfortunately, we sort of get to that process having reached its fulfillment with the Iceni and the Trinovantes, etc., and moving on to another step in 60. So it's, you know.
And that's why the archaeology is so important, because I mean that helps to really bed the narrative, which, if you think about it, I mean, the narrative Suetonius is writing about 40 years after the invasion, and then Cassius Dio is wrting maybe 150 years later. So they're all separated in time, and you could argue the Agricola maybe is closer, well, actually contemporary of Suetonius. So the archaeology gives us the contemporary picture, which of course you have to interpret.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that just to make it clear for those who are listening, the narrative sources for the invasion and the run up to it, the preparations, and as Mark said, the first 2 decades after of the occupation and the fight to occupy Britain, they're extremely limited. We wish we had more, but we just don't. It's one of those things that Brigitte Hoffmann in her article makes very clear. We barely know exactly how big the army was that went there. There's probably 3 legions, could have been 4. We're not even sure which one they were, except for Secunda Augusta, because that's associated with Vespasian, whose career we're well familiar with. So we can probably reconstruct which legions were there, but
even in terms of the guy who leads the whole thing, I mean, Aulus Plautius, he goes over as the, you know, lead man for the invasion. He's there for Claudius, you know, coming over to do the officialdom and whatnot. It's not really clear exactly how long he remains in that position. We hear about him coming back to Rome and receiving the an ovation, I think it is, that he gets as reward and whatnot. But it's not clear exactly how long he's actually had to toil to actually, consolidate his invasion measures.
Well, to that point, Mark, this is one of the things that often gets lost, and I'm so glad it's in the magazine, the quote from Eutropius, which brings in Sentius Saturninus. So it sounds like it was maybe a double act. I mean, they probably realized that, as in the invasions of, for example, under Germanicus and Tiberius in working in Germania, you couldn't have just one man running the invasion. You had to have it divided up, and they would actually do their, what's the word I'm looking for? Flanking movements and this type of thing. So it's really interesting that Eutropius is the only source that we seem to have that mentions another guy in addition to Plautius. So Plautius, I think, wrongly hogged the limelight.
Yeah,
that's so late, but there's that, it teases in Dio Cassius when he sort of mentions, of course, the arrival and he uses that word about the three, the triple something, whether it's an arrival of three forces under three different commanders. If it's three legions, are they going over in three waves as such in some way? But of course, that again hints at, there's something more to the leadership than we get the emphasis on Vespasian, because of course what he becomes later on. So you get the emphasis on Aulus Plautius, but apart from that, it's sort of, we have to wait 500 years for somebody else to come along and say, hey, there was another guy there.
Well, it's really interesting because right now I've been writing about the Bar War, and I'm wrestling. So, for example, the great thing there is it was another British governor, Julius Severus, that actually goes in and effectively turns the war around for Hadrian. And the case is there's already a governor there, and in fact they brought in all these other legates from Mysia and Syria and all sorts of. And the fundamental question is, they're all pretty much the same grade, and they've all got consular backgrounds. How does the command structure work? The Romans are very, very petty when it comes to, well, I'm and I should be respected for my background and my rank. And these sorts of details are lost. It'd be wonderful to find out how an actual campaign worked from that I'm in charge and you follow my rules. Otherwise, I think when you look at some of the ways that the Romans dealt with the Great Illyrian Revolt of 6 to 9, it wasn't very well structured and it was chaotic. So the implication of the British invasion is it's very well structured.
Well, I wonder though, obviously we're dealing with the fact that we've lost so much, because I think Eutropius, writing in 369, is using Enmund's Kaisergeschichte as his source, supposedly, which is that fabulous. He says something we don't know. Here's a source we've not found that we've speculated exists, and that's where he got it from. So it could be earlier. We don't know. But there's tantalizing glimpses that Britain is a consciousness of Rome. You have Honestander writing the general on how to be a general for the governor of 51. Presumably, you would write it before he went and took a command of a province. So therefore, he's writing it at the time in 50. So there's that kind of must have been in the consciousness. You've got a couple of anecdotes in Frontinus's stratagems which seem to relate to Britain. And that obviously he was a governor of Britain himself in the 70s, and then he's writing his stratagems in the 80s. So there's sort of tantalizing glimpses of that it was in the consciousness of Rome, not forgotten for 6 years until we get the Agricola's biography. Poor old Frontinus gets a single sentence in the Agricola, and the books of the history missing for what we need of him. So it's an issue of, I think, of loss rather than.
Happened, I mean, so when Claudius dies, it's crikey, 54? Have I got this right? And then you get move on a few years, then you get this horrible year 69, and then the Julio-Claudians effectively are conveniently, their memory is moved sideways, so the Flavians can now actually dictate how history is written, and effectively what they want to do is disconnect them from the bad actors, the Caligulas and the Neros and so on. And then you get onto the much later. So in fact, I wonder whether Britain goes out of sight slightly because there are other things to worry about.
Well, I think the fact is that when you look into the Flavians, there's wars everywhere, really. But I think they're still doing the same sorts of things of proving themselves. You know,
right,
I
but
think
Domitian, for example, goes to Germany against the Catti, for example, and then there's
well, and he has a Dacian campaign which is completely forgotten about today. You know, Trajan was following Trajan was following Domitian in the Dacian Wars, not coming up with a new. So I think that, you know, the Chatti and the invasions of Dacia are also about proving your mettle, and very similar to the Claudian sort of model, but because they're a new imperial family in the Flavians, and because both Vespasian and Titus have proved their mettle in the Near East, Domitian, poor old Domitian, has to find somewhere new to prove his mettle, and so he chooses the German and the Rhine and the Danube frontier. So it's a very interesting issue that I think Jones, yes, wrote a book about Domitian and included the idea that because it had no visible spoil, you know, it was a boring war, and therefore got lambasted in the media, in the propaganda, in the anti-Domitian propaganda especially. But it was a very sort of necessary grind campaign, but nothing to show for it. And I think we were talking earlier about optics, and I think one of the things about so many campaigns in the ancient world need optics, even if they're invented optics. I mean, look at the Arch of Titus to this day is probably the main optics of that campaign against the ancient Judea. So it's a really interesting lesson that some of the emperors don't learn, that you've got to show what you've earned. You can't just earn something without there being any sort of visible sign of success.
Yep, lesson for us all there.
Well, just taking it away from Britain for a bit. We have one more question left from Abram from Patreon. He points to Suetonius' Life of Claudius, paragraph 21, in which it is mentioned that Claudius hosted a yearly gladiatorial show in the Praetorian camp without wild beasts and fine equipment. And he asks, how common were special events held in the Praetorian camp as bonuses to the guard? It's a very specific question. Claudius, of course, just to start it off and to frame it, maybe Claudius had he owed his position to the imperial guard, whether that was due to coincidence because they found him with his shoes peeping out from under a curtain, or whether that was actually a setup and it had all been decided beforehand. The Praetorian Guard clearly decided that he was going to be the next emperor of Rome, and Claudius rewarded them for it on the spot when they made him emperor, and did so every year after, with both a bonus in money and gladiatorial events. But do we know of any other emperors or anybody else having special events in the Praetorian camp?
Well, I just remember that Caligula issued the famous, as it De Pondus, I suppose, with the ad locutio, where he's in his toga and his hand raised, and he's got a group of Praetorians. You know, it's something that became expected. So it sounds like what Claudius seems to have done is made it an annual thing as opposed to just on the accession.
But Claudius goes like the camp of the Praetorians features very heavily throughout the life of Claudius, as told by Suetonius. You have, of course, not just in terms of the death of Caligula, after the death of Caligula, Claudius being in the Praetorian camp for the night, and the next day sending a message to the Senate saying, I'm being held forcefully here, and then these are the guys who are presenting me. But then later on, there's, of course, Claudius becomes notoriously paranoid about the possibility of betrayal or murder or treachery, and there's references in Suetonius to him fleeing to the Praetorian camp for protection and whatnot. So it may be a comment by Suetonius being made here about how reliant he is on the Praetorians. I mean, he's also got another guard, the Germanic guard, who gets much less press throughout his career, especially by Suetonius. So is it a trope that he is reliant upon them more than any other, or is it a reality that they are really the power behind the throne here?
Perhaps he was just inspecting the Praetorian camp. But yes, sorry to make a political reference. Look, I think the funny thing about it is that the annual games is an interesting aspect, but the fact of it is that by not having equipment and not having beast shows, which is obviously the point. There's the famous episode in Suetonius and Pliny where he talks about the lavish decorations that Nero, he sent a guy to the Baltic Sea to get amber back to decorate the entire arena. I think the idea that gladiatorial contests by themselves were popular, but that the fine equipment and the beast shows are for popular. They're bred in circuses. They're for the people of Rome to sort of hated, but gladiatorial. So it's sort of the real fighting as opposed to what you do for the show. So whether you're a fan of wrestling or MMA compared to the real thing, that's a particularly interesting idea about the fact that knowing what they want as opposed to giving them just a donative or just cash. The idea of holding a games that's unspectacular, if you like, for the Praetorians is an interesting take.
But what the corollary of that is what effectively you're doing is you're making an annual commitment, a reaffirmation of the contract, if you will, and that serves both parties very well, I think.
He's the first one to actually give that donative as well.
Yeah. It just goes back to the perennial problem of certainly the early emperors is how do you organize the succession? Do you want to organize the succession at all? Yeah.
Yeah, I think as a scholar of Augustus, I think he would be quite astonished to see how actually the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended up, because it was not at all what he planned. But he was very unfortunate in the bad luck that he had all the people he sort of set up to become his successors, in fact, fall away, and you're left with Tiberius, who didn't want the job.
Yeah. Well, I think it's maybe Augustus used up all the good luck in the way, so that was the thing,
Well, it is funny the fact that he actually thought about these things. What did he reign for? About 45 years, something like that, which is amongst the longest of any of the imperial. So he got a lot right. I think this is an extraordinary thing. There were assassination attempts on his life. He did wars of choice and wars of necessity, and he eventually found out there's a sort of constraining factor to the ability of the capability of the Roman military to guard this dominion of the Roman people. And other people that succeeded him kind of didn't realize that. They played with it. And in the end, when you get back to Hadrian, he said, okay, we're going to collapse it back to where Augustus decided it was going to be. So if they just went back and read the biographies of Augustus, they'd have got a lot more done, I think.
Claudius should have known. We're out of questions right now, and I don't think any questions have come in via the live stream. We seem to be on our own tonight. Everybody's distracted with other things.
I think it's worth pointing out that Claudius and other emperors of this first century were well served by various generals, not necessarily aristocrats, but for example, I'm thinking of Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, who was serving Claudius sometime around 47 AD as the earliest we know, but he's almost certainly doing something beforehand. There was Vespasian with the second Augusta, who was serving in Britain around this time. There's Aulus Plautius in Britain too, who received the ovation for what he did there. So clearly there are very capable commanders, and so even if Claudius himself was an unmilitary figure, which I think is undeniable, they had good officers who could actually carry out the campaigns on their behalf. Corbulo would go on to serve very well for Nero. It would end unhappily for him, but he served well under Nero too.
But the problem with all these guys that you've just mentioned is that increasingly, during Claudius's reign, you've got, and it does start under Augustus, of course, increasingly the imperial command is relying upon family connections. All these guys are tied in. I mean, we've mentioned already Aulus Plautius, who had been tied in himself. I think his sister is one of Claudius's early wives. As opposed to these generals who are all being tied into the imperial family, perhaps what we should be looking at in terms of the Praetorians is a counterbalance for Claudius of who he's relying on, because it's either the family or it's going to be his second family, the Praetorian Guard, one against the other. And I mean, you can see that warfare takes place. I mean, the commander of the Praetorian Guard is actually himself a victim of the plotting within the imperial family between one of the freedmen that is a favorite of Claudius, a guy by the name of Narcissus, ironically, and of course one of the wives of Claudius, Messalina, who herself ends up one of the victims later on. I mean, it is a counterbalance, and I mean, Claudius comes out in the sources with this horrible portrayal of being, this drooling, stuttering guy who has no right to be there, who Augustus himself wanted to get rid of from the family because he was embarrassment, and who he basically was sending letters around saying, look, let's just deal with this now and not, come back to it time and time again. The answer is going to be he can't be in the public limelight. But of course, that's our take on him from our sources. Maybe a little bit of credit is due to him a little bit more in terms of using the Praetorians as that counterbalance, perhaps.
Yeah, so to take up the point about the generals, I think that it's very easy to forget how many of them there would have been. So if you think about the system that Augustus set up, you have basically the consular provinces and the Praetorian ones that he set up, and there are like 13 or something that they're responsible in his general province, and each one of those is an army group commander who has several legions under his disposal, and each one of those will be picked by the emperor. So they're constantly having to negotiate and manage human relations and relationships, because they need, I think someone said earlier, to be able to trust these people. And one way to bring them into the fold is to bring them through marriage and get them bound in that way. And if they don't perform, they divorce and they marry somebody else. So I think that for every Aulus Plautius and Saturninus, there's 20 other people that are doing the same sort of thing. And it's I think testament to how good the Julio-Claudians were, that they could be incompetent, but they surrounded themselves with, by and large, good people.
That's the trick of the
manager. It's also interesting that there's a balance. There's a balance of between looking backwards, forwards, and looking after yourself in all of these things. Because, like Corbulo, for instance, his daughter Domitia married, so that in a later age, Corbulo, who does, when Nero demands that he falls on his sword, because you're talking about trust, and the problem, of course, with Nero and other tyrannical emperors is that when they have a trusted servant who does too well, then they become remarkable. And then you have the issue that later his memory is revived, possibly as resistance to Domitian, that Domitia is the daughter of Corbulo, and therefore that sort of real discipline, real Roman, virtue, rather than Domitian's, tyrannicalness.
Less attractive.
There's the word. That's the one I'm looking. Too many syllables I'm looking for. Put some syllables in there. And so I think that there is that interesting thing that you've got. Looking for merit and competence in its own right, but you've also got a looking backwards to a certain extent, but also, forging your own way. So it's a very interesting balance of all of those things. And I think, again, the picture of Claudius, as you say, Mark, in the sources is a doddering imbecile, but he clearly wasn't. The fact that he composed a history shows us that he must have been, if not physically fit, certainly intellectually capable. And I think that
well, you have to be careful that you're now describing us and then just portraying that onto Claudius.
Well, physically fit, certainly, yes, good point. Okay, I'll shush now.
But to extend that idea,
I'll wipe my drool.
to extend the idea one step further, I think that what it all hints at is how precarious the whole thing is. Claudius is surrounded by people with lots of sharp, pointy objects, and Cassius Correa that she killed off Caligula. So I'm sure there's always this idea that I always have to do good by all these people in order to survive. And then the story is he gets killed by a lady with poisoned mushrooms. So he did get killed in the end that way. But I think it's an amazing achievement that these people actually did last as long as they did.
But there's also there's a slight hint that the Praetorians are feeling the same way, because if you think about some of the things that the Praetorians are said to have done, then it sort of hints that they might be actually trying to curry favor themselves. I mean, there's the mention that Claudius is so fearful at his dinner parties, and instead of just having a couple of Praetorian guards standing at the door, he actually employs them as his waiting staff, so that they are there at the table waiting in case something happens. He has them patting down anybody and everybody who's coming within 100 feet of him. But then as well, the Praetorians are also themselves being the front and center of entertainment shows, like there's the description of a panther hunt in the circus where they are showing off their cavalry. But if you think about it, what's in it for them? They are trying to emphasize their importance to the emperor just as much as he's trying to emphasize to them how he feels about them. So I think there's
they've got a very good peak, isn't it? I mean, they're earning a lot more than the regular legionary. They serve fewer years than the legionary, and they get bigger payout at the end of it. And they get to travel. So whenever the emperor goes somewhere, 2, 3, 4 cohorts go with him. They do get to see the world and rake in the money. So I think you're right that there's a lot at stake for them as well.
There was an article a couple of issues ago about the dodgy dealings of the Praetorians and all the missions that they undertook for the emperors, which were less than savory.
That's actually this. Ross Cohen wrote about all the jobs that Claudius had for him.
13.5?
No, that's actually this issue.
Okay, I've got confused. Right. I've been blinded by too many proofings.
So I think we're all rather impressed by this man called Claudius, is the impression I'm having here. And there was an exhibition in Rome, which I wrote about in the news several issues ago for Ancient History. And when you look back at what he achieved, I mean, there were the political reforms. He did things with the army as well. So what he actually did was a very good job of stabilizing a system which effectively Augustus had played at, Tiberius pretty much neglected, Caligula didn't do anything with either. So it was really down to this man to make sure that it had a future. And it would seem to be based on the evidence he did a good job.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's unfortunate that we have so few sources, and the most important one is the gossip columnist, which is a bit denigrating. But Tacitus, we're missing, was it 4 or 5 books of Tacitus here that might have balanced it out very nicely.
Well, let's do this. Murray, in the preamble before our podcast, was talking about how someone had written that they were looking forward to this proof, and then they wished for it, and then several years later, this proof came. So, let's wish for those lost books of Tacitus, and by the a few volumes of his Etruscan history, because I should like to know how Etruscan was written.
Why do you think Claudius was noted for writing histories of Carthage as well as the Etruscans? Why do you think those histories disappeared entirely? This was an emperor who authored those works. Shouldn't they have survived somehow?
Well, look, all the biographies of Augustus are lost. There's 12 volumes of those. He wrote several editions. Just the randomness of time, I think.
What is it? 97% is supposed to be lost.
Yeah,
of the written
no
sources.
more than that. Yeah.
So we have to hope that the Villa dei Papiri, for example, may well yet produce some of these lost works. But you never know. I mean, who knows?
Well, I think if we can put a call out to everyone in Europe just to check their basement or their attic, because
see if any book rolls with codexes.
If you've got some old, exactly. If you've got some old flask that's got some, wound up bit of paper bunging it, check that out, because that could be the, I think that was the letters of Fronto.
And a special plea for all the monks out there: could you please look in your very, very deep basement?
Yeah, just take a break from brewing all that nice beer and check your basement.
That's right.
All right.
Well, even
on that plea, I thought on that plea we could probably shut this one down. And once those missing books turn up, we'll do it again. Thanks.
You heard it here first. Yeah.